The morning light filtered through our kitchen window as I watched Maggie pour her coffee, her movements precise and distant. 23 years of marriage had taught me to read the subtle signs. The way she held her shoulders, the slight tilt of her head when something occupied her thoughts. Something had changed in recent months, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. John, I'm planning something special for my birthday next month, she said, not meeting my eyes. I want to invite everyone, our friends, the boys, maybe some people from work. I nodded, sipping my own coffee. As a structural engineer, I'd learned that foundations matter most. When they shift, everything above becomes unstable. Our foundation had been shifting for months, small tremors I'd chosen to ignore. That sounds nice, I replied, though something in her tone suggested this party would be anything but simple. Maggie worked at Henderson & Associates, a prestigious law firm downtown. She'd started there 5 years ago as a paralegal, ambitious and eager to prove herself. The work energized her in ways I hadn't seen since our early years together. But with that energy came new friends, new interests, and increasingly, a new distance between us. I was thinking of inviting Brett too, she added casually, refilling her cup. You remember Brett from college, right? He's my supervisor now. Brett. The name hit me like a cold wave. Brett Morrison had been Maggie's boyfriend before we met, back when we were all students at State. Tall, charismatic, the kind of guy who commanded attention without trying. I remembered him well, too well. Brett's working at your firm now? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. He joined as a senior partner 6 months ago. He's been really helpful, showing me the ropes, giving me opportunities to work on bigger cases. Her cheeks flushed slightly as she spoke. 6 months. The timeline aligned perfectly with when I'd first noticed the changes in Maggie. The late nights, the increased attention to her appearance, the way she'd started checking her phone constantly. Sure, invite whoever you want, I said, though every instinct screamed warnings. After Maggie left for work, I sat alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the life we'd built together. Our suburban home reflected years of careful planning and compromise. Family photos lined the mantel, showing our 2 sons, Sydney and James, at various stages of their lives. Both were grown now. Sydney worked as a teacher in Oregon, while James had followed my path into engineering and lived across town. My business partnership with Bob Richardson had been thriving. We'd started Richardson & Hayes Engineering 15 years ago, building a solid reputation for commercial projects throughout the state. The work demanded long hours and frequent travel, something Maggie had grown increasingly resentful about. You're always gone, she'd complained recently. When you are here, you're thinking about work or that boat of yours. She wasn't entirely wrong. My 40-foot sailboat, Persistence, had become my refuge. Weekend trips to the marina, working on repairs and improvements, planning longer voyages I never seemed to have time for. These activities provided the peace that home increasingly couldn't offer. But I'd never imagined that my absences were creating space for someone else to fill. The next few weeks passed in a blur of work and preparation. Maggie threw herself into party planning with an enthusiasm that seemed excessive for a simple birthday celebration. She bought a new dress, red, form-fitting, more daring than anything she'd worn in years. She scheduled appointments at the salon, updated her makeup collection, and spent hours on phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room. Just coordinating with people, she'd explain, but her explanations felt hollow. I found myself paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. The way she hummed while getting ready for work. How she'd started working out again, claiming she wanted to feel good about herself. The frequency of her client dinners and office meetings that kept her out until late evening. One night, I decided to surprise her with dinner at Romano's, the Italian place where we'd had our first date. I drove to her office building, planning to catch her as she left work. I waited in the parking garage for over an hour. Finally, the elevator doors opened, and Maggie emerged. Not alone. Brett walked beside her, his hand resting on the small of her back as they moved toward the cars. They stopped beside her Honda, talking in low voices, standing closer than necessary. Even from a distance, I could see the intimacy in their body language, the way she tilted her head up toward him, how he leaned down, his face inches from hers. They didn't embrace, didn't do anything overtly inappropriate, but the connection between them was unmistakable. I started my truck and drove home, the dinner reservation forgotten. That night, Maggie came home at nearly 10 o'clock, claiming she'd been stuck in a meeting with difficult clients. She chatted about her day while changing clothes, her voice bright and animated. Too animated. "How was your day?" she asked, settling into bed beside me. "Fine," I replied, staring at the ceiling. "Just the usual." She curled against me, her hand resting on my chest. For a moment, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined what I'd seen in the parking garage. This was Maggie, my wife, the mother of my children. We'd weathered difficulties before, financial stress, family problems, the normal challenges that test any marriage. But trust, once questioned, becomes a lens that colors everything. Over the following days, I found myself analyzing every interaction, every explanation, every smile that seemed too bright, or laugh that lasted too long. The birthday party approached like a storm on the horizon, visible, inevitable, and potentially devastating. The day of Maggie's 45th birthday arrived with unseasonably warm weather for October. She'd been preparing for weeks, transforming our backyard into an elegant party space with string lights, rented tables, and enough food to feed an army. Her excitement was palpable, almost manic. "I want everything to be perfect," she'd said repeatedly, adjusting decorations and checking her reflection in every mirror she passed. I'd offered to help, but she'd waved me off. "Just be ready by 6, okay? And please try to enjoy yourself." The comment stung. When had enjoying my wife's birthday party become something I needed to try to do? Guests began arriving at 6:30. Our longtime friends came first, the Hendersons, the Kowalskis, couples we'd known for decades. Then came Maggie's work colleagues, people I recognized from previous office functions. Finally, at nearly 7 o'clock, Brett arrived. He hadn't changed much since college, still tall and lean, with premature gray at his temples that somehow made him look distinguished rather than old. He wore an expensive suit, casual but perfectly tailored, and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most important person in any room. "Johnny!" he called out, approaching with arms extended as if we were old friends. "Great to see you again, buddy. Maggie's told me so much about you." We shook hands, his grip firm and lingering. "Brett, welcome to our home. Beautiful place you've got here. Maggie mentioned you're still sailing. That old Catalina from college?" "No, I have a different boat now." I didn't elaborate, though he seemed to expect more details. "Well, we'll have to catch up properly later. I should find the birthday girl and give her my congratulations." He moved away, scanning the crowd until he spotted Maggie near the bar. I watched as his face lit up, watched as she turned toward him with a smile that transformed her entire expression. They embraced, a hug that lasted several seconds too long, her hand lingering on his shoulder as they separated. "Everything okay?" Bob Richardson appeared at my elbow, following my gaze. "You look like you're watching a tennis match." Bob and I had been partners for 15 years, but our friendship went back much further. He'd been my roommate in college, the best man at my wedding, godfather to both my sons. If anyone would notice my distress, it would be Bob. "Just keeping an eye on things," I replied. "Uh-huh." Bob's tone suggested he wasn't buying my casual response. "That's the famous Brett, I assume." "That's him." We stood in comfortable silence, watching as Brett charmed the other guests. He had a gift for making people laugh, for drawing them into his orbit. Several times I caught him glancing toward Maggie, and she toward him, as if they were sharing private jokes across the crowded yard. Sydney and James arrived together around 8 o'clock, both looking uncomfortable in their dress clothes. At 28 and 25, respectively, my sons had inherited my tendency toward practical clothing and straightforward communication. They hugged their mother, made polite conversation with the guests, and eventually gravitated toward me. "Mom seems really happy," Sydney observed, watching as Maggie laughed at something Brett was saying. "She's been looking forward to this," I replied. James, ever more direct than his older brother, studied the interaction between his mother and Brett with obvious curiosity. "Who's the guy she keeps talking to?" "Someone from her office." "They knew each other in college." "Before you and Mom got together?" "Yes." James nodded slowly, his engineer's mind clearly processing the implications. He'd always been perceptive, able to see patterns and connections that others missed. As the evening progressed, I found myself increasingly isolated from the celebration. Maggie flitted from group to group, playing the perfect hostess, but she seemed to orbit consistently back to Brett. They talked about work, about mutual acquaintances from college, about places they'd both traveled. Their conversation flowed with an ease that made my chest tighten. Around 10 o'clock, most of the guests began making their departures. Work nights and babysitters called people home, leaving only a core group of close friends and family. Brett, I noticed, showed no signs of leaving. "Another drink?" Maggie asked, appearing beside me with a wine bottle. "I'm good, thanks." She refilled her own glass, her fourth or fifth of the evening. The wine had brought color to her cheeks and a brightness to her eyes that I hadn't seen in months. "Are you having fun?" she asked. "It's a nice party. You did a great job." "But are you having fun?" she pressed. "You seem distant tonight." The irony of her observation wasn't lost on me. "Just tired, I guess. Long week." She nodded, though her attention had already shifted. Brett was telling a story to the remaining guests, gesturing animatedly, and Maggie was drawn back to his performance like a moth to flame. By 11:30, only Bob and his wife Linda remained, along with Brett and a couple of Maggie's work friends. My sons had left an hour earlier, both citing early morning commitments. The party had moved inside, the group settling in our living room with coffee and leftover cake. Brett had positioned himself on the couch beside Maggie, close enough that their knees touched when either of them shifted position. He'd loosened his tie and rolled up his sleeves, clearly comfortable and in no hurry to leave. "Remember that time in Professor Martinez's class," Brett was saying, "when you challenged his entire lecture on contract law interpretation?" Maggie laughed, her hand briefly touching his arm. "I was so nervous afterward. I thought he'd fail me for sure." "But you were right. And he knew it. That's when I realized how brilliant you really were." The compliment hung in the air, intimate and charged. I felt Linda Richardson's eyes on me, her expression sympathetic and concerned. "Well," Bob announced, standing and stretching, "Linda and I should head home, early morning tomorrow." "Of course," Maggie said, though she made no move to get up from beside Brett. "Thank you so much for coming. It means everything to have you here." Bob and Linda hugged Maggie goodbye, then approached me near the kitchen doorway. "Great party," Bob said quietly. "Call me tomorrow, okay?" I nodded, understanding the subtext. Bob had seen what I'd seen, felt the undercurrents that ran beneath the evening's surface pleasantries. After they left, Maggie's work friends also made their departures, leaving just the three of us in the suddenly quiet house. I began collecting glasses and plates, needing something to do with my hands. "Leave that," Maggie said. "We can clean up tomorrow." "I don't mind." Brett checked his watch, an expensive piece that caught the light from our table lamps. "I should probably get going too. Early meeting in the morning." "Already?" Maggie's disappointment was obvious. The night's still young. I know, but duty calls. He stood, straightening his tie. Thank you for including me tonight. It's been wonderful catching up with old friends. He shook my hand again, his grip firm and his smile confident. Great seeing you again, Johnny. We should grab lunch sometime, talk about old times. Sure, I replied, though we both knew the invitation was empty courtesy. Maggie walked him to the door while I continued clearing dishes. I could hear their voices in the foyer, low and intimate, but couldn't make out the words. The conversation lasted several minutes, far longer than a simple goodbye required. When Maggie returned to the living room, her cheeks were flushed and her eyes bright with an energy that had nothing to do with the wine. That was fun, she said, beginning to help with the cleanup. I think everyone had a good time. Seemed like it. Brett was so sweet to come. He's been working such long hours lately, I wasn't sure he'd be able to make it. He seemed to enjoy himself. She paused in her gathering of napkins, studying my face. You don't like him. It wasn't a question, and I considered my response carefully. I don't know him well enough to like or dislike him. But you don't like that I invited him. It's your birthday party, Maggie. You can invite whoever you want. She nodded, but I could see the wheels turning behind her eyes. We finished cleaning in relative silence, the easy intimacy that had once characterized our conversations replaced by careful politeness. As we prepared for bed, I found myself studying my wife's reflection in our bathroom mirror. She removed her makeup with unusual care, as if preserving something precious. Her new red dress hung on the closet door, a splash of color in our neutral bedroom. Did I tell you Brett's getting divorced? She said suddenly, her voice carefully casual. My hands stilled on the buttons of my shirt. No, you didn't mention that. It's been difficult for him. His wife, well, I probably shouldn't gossip. But it's been hard, trying to focus on work while dealing with all the legal complications. I'm sure it has been. She turned from the mirror to face me directly. He's been a good friend, John. Having someone who understands the legal world, who can offer advice and support. It's meant a lot to me professionally. I understand. But I didn't understand. Not really. What I understood was that my wife was explaining herself to me, justifying a relationship that shouldn't need justification. What I understood was that she'd brought her former boyfriend into our home, into our life, and was now telling me about his availability. We lay in bed that night, the space between us feeling wider than the few inches it actually measured. Maggie fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the party and the wine, but I stared at the ceiling for hours. The foundation was definitely shifting now. The question was whether the structure above could survive what was coming. The weeks following Maggie's birthday party brought a subtle but unmistakable change in our household's rhythm. She began staying late at work more frequently, her explanations becoming increasingly elaborate. Client meetings that ran past normal business hours, research projects that required weekend attention, conferences and seminars that seemed to multiply exponentially. The Morrison case is incredibly complex, she explained one evening, arriving home after 9 o'clock. Brett's been walking me through the precedent research, but there's just so much material to cover. The Morrison case. Even the name felt like a cruel joke. I'd begun paying attention to patterns, my engineering mind automatically cataloging data points. Maggie's late nights coincided with Brett's schedule, something I'd confirmed by calling her office on several occasions, only to be told that both she and Mr. Morrison were in meetings. Her phone habits had changed too. She now kept it face down during dinner and took calls in private, stepping onto the back patio or into our bedroom with the door closed. Most telling of all was her physical transformation. The woman who'd worn the same basic wardrobe for years had suddenly developed an interest in fashion. New dresses appeared in our closet, along with shoes that seemed impractical for office work and lingerie that remained unworn for my benefit. You look nice, I commented one morning as she prepared for work in a fitted black dress I'd never seen before. "Thank you," she replied, but her smile seemed forced. "I have a client presentation today. Brett says first impressions matter in this business." Brett says. The phrase had become a regular part of her vocabulary, preceding opinions on everything from legal strategy to restaurant recommendations to weekend plans. My own work provided some distraction from the growing tension at home. Bob and I were managing 3 major projects simultaneously, including a complex renovation of the downtown convention center that required constant oversight. The demanding schedule meant long days and frequent site visits, but I found myself grateful for the excuse to avoid home during Maggie's increasingly erratic hours. "You're pushing yourself pretty hard," Bob observed one afternoon as we reviewed structural calculations in our office. "When's the last time you took a real break?" "I'm fine." "That's not what I asked." He set down his pencil and studied me with the directness that had made him both a good friend and an excellent business partner. "Linda's worried about you. Hell, I'm worried about you. You look like you haven't slept properly in weeks." He wasn't wrong. Sleep had become elusive, my mind racing through scenarios and possibilities I didn't want to confront. I'd taken to working late in my home office, partly to avoid the awkward conversations that occurred when Maggie and I were alone together. "Things are a bit complicated at home right now," I admitted. "The birthday party guy?" Bob's perception shouldn't have surprised me, but it did. "You noticed?" Linda noticed. She said the tension in your living room was thick enough to cut with a knife. He leaned back in his chair, his expression serious. "Want to talk about it?" I considered his offer, weighing the relief of confession against the humiliation of admitting my suspicions. "I think Maggie might be having an affair." The words hung in the air between us, making the situation real in a way that internal worry couldn't match. "Are you sure?" "Not completely, but all the signs are there. Late nights, new clothes, secretive phone calls, and the way she looked at him during the party." I trailed off, remembering the intimacy I'd witnessed. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know. Part of me hopes I'm wrong, that I'm reading too much into innocent interactions, but another part of me knows better." Bob nodded slowly. "If you need anything, time off, someone to talk to, whatever, just ask. And if you want my advice, get some concrete proof before you make any major decisions. Suspicions can eat you alive, but facts give you options." His suggestion made sense, though the thought of actively investigating my wife's activities felt like crossing a line I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. That evening, I arrived home to find Maggie in the kitchen, preparing what appeared to be an elaborate dinner. Candles flickered on our dining room table, and she'd opened a bottle of wine that I recognized as one we'd been saving for a special occasion. "What's all this?" I asked. "Can't a wife make a nice dinner for her husband?" She smiled, but there was something forced about her cheerfulness. I realized we haven't been spending much quality time together lately. The irony of her observation wasn't lost on me, but I played along. We ate dinner by candlelight, making conversation about work and weekend plans, both of us carefully avoiding any topics that might lead to conflict. Maggie had prepared my favorite meal, grilled salmon with roasted vegetables, and she'd clearly made an effort with her appearance. "This is nice," I said, and meant it, despite the underlying tension. "I've been thinking," she began, refilling our wine glasses. "Maybe we should plan a vacation, just the two of us. It's been years since we've had real time alone together." "That sounds good. Where were you thinking?" "I don't know. Somewhere warm, maybe. The Caribbean? We could take that sailing trip you've always talked about." The suggestion should have thrilled me. I'd been dreaming of extended sailing voyages for years, but work and family obligations had always interfered. Now, however, the offer felt more like appeasement than genuine interest. "We could look into it," I replied noncommittally. After dinner, we settled on the couch to watch a movie. Maggie curled against my side in a way that reminded me of our early years together. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that I'd been wrong, that my suspicions were the product of an overactive imagination and too much stress. Then her phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at the screen, and I watched her expression change. A subtle shift that someone who hadn't been married to her for 23 years might have missed. Her body tensed slightly, and she shifted away from me under the pretense of reaching for her wine glass. "Work?" I asked. "Just a friend," she replied. But she didn't put the phone down. Instead, she held it in her lap, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. "Feel free to respond. I don't mind." "It's not important. It can wait." But her attention had clearly shifted. She kept glancing at the phone throughout the remainder of the movie, her responses to my comments becoming increasingly distracted. Finally, she stood and stretched. "I think I'll take a bath and read for a while. That wine made me sleepy." "Good idea. I'll probably stay up and work on some project notes." She kissed my forehead, a gesture that felt more sisterly than romantic, and headed upstairs. I waited until I heard the bathroom door close and water running in the tub, then quietly climbed the stairs myself. Our bedroom door was ajar, and through the gap, I could see Maggie's phone lying on her nightstand. The temptation was overwhelming, but I forced myself to return downstairs. Whatever I might find on that phone would change everything, and I wasn't sure I was ready for that level of certainty. Instead, I poured myself a scotch and sat in my home office, staring at blueprints without really seeing them. Outside, October wind rattled the windows, and I found myself thinking about my boat, about the freedom of open water and the simplicity of navigation by stars and compass. The next morning brought an unexpected opportunity for clarity. Maggie announced that she'd be attending a legal conference in the state capitol, a 2-day event that would require an overnight stay. "It's focused on corporate litigation strategies," she explained over breakfast. "Brett thinks it would be valuable for my professional development." "Brett's going too?" "Several people from the firm are attending. It's a good networking opportunity." She left that afternoon with an overnight bag that seemed too large for a single night away. I watched from our bedroom window as she loaded her car, noting that she'd packed the new red dress from her birthday party. After she left, I found myself alone in our house with my suspicions and an overwhelming need for answers. I'd spent weeks wondering, worrying, and analyzing every interaction. Bob's advice echoed in my mind. Facts give you options. I started with Maggie's home office, a small room where she kept files and did occasional work from home. Her desk was meticulously organized, but I found nothing obviously incriminating. Then I remembered her laptop, which she sometimes left charging in the kitchen. The computer was password protected, but I knew Maggie well enough to guess correctly on the third try. Sydney's birthday, followed by James's initials. Her email account opened easily, revealing dozens of messages from Brett Morrison. The early emails were professional: case discussions, meeting schedules, routine office communications. But as I scrolled through more recent messages, the tone gradually shifted. Compliments became more personal, references to shared memories appeared, and eventually the correspondence took on an unmistakably intimate character. One email from the previous week made my hands shake as I read it. Maggie, I can't stop thinking about our conversation yesterday. You're right that the situation is complicated, but I've never felt this connected to anyone. John is lucky to have you, but I can't help wondering if he truly appreciates what he has. The conference this weekend will give us time to talk properly, away from the office pressures. I'm counting the hours until I see you again. B. Her response was shorter but equally revealing. Brett, I feel the same way. This is scary and exciting and completely crazy, but I can't deny what's happening between us. See you Friday. M. I read the exchange 3 times, each reading confirming what I'd feared, but hoped wasn't true. My wife of 23 years, the mother of my children, was having an affair with her former boyfriend. The confirmation brought an unexpected sense of relief mixed with devastating sadness. The uncertainty had been torture. Now, at least, I knew what I was dealing with. I spent the evening planning my next steps, my engineering background helping me approach the situation methodically. I needed more evidence, documentation that would protect me legally and financially. I also needed to decide how and when to confront Maggie, and what outcome I hoped to achieve. Most importantly, I needed to prepare myself for the possibility that my marriage, the foundation upon which I'd built my adult life, was beyond repair. The house felt different that night, empty in a way that had nothing to do with Maggie's physical absence. I walked through rooms filled with memories, looking at photographs and mementos that suddenly seemed like artifacts from someone else's life. In our bedroom, I opened the closet and studied the space where Maggie's new clothes hung alongside older, familiar items. The red dress was gone, of course, packed for her romantic weekend with Brett. I slept in the guest room that night, unable to face our marriage bed alone. Tomorrow, Maggie would return from her conference, and I would have to decide how much of what I knew to reveal. The foundation wasn't just shifting anymore. It was cracking, and I could hear the structure above beginning to groan under the strain. Maggie returned from her conference Sunday evening with a glow that had nothing to do with professional development. She chattered about the seminars she'd attended, the contacts she'd made, and the insights she'd gained, but her enthusiasm felt performative, as if she were reciting lines from a script. "How was your weekend?" she asked as she unpacked her overnight bag. "Quiet. Caught up on some reading, worked on the boat a bit." "Good for you. You need more downtime." I watched as she handled her clothes, noting that the red dress went directly into the laundry hamper, despite having been worn for only a few hours. The gesture struck me as unnecessarily cautious, unless there was something about the dress she wanted to wash away. Over the following week, I continued gathering evidence while maintaining a facade of normalcy. I installed a small recording device in Maggie's car, justified to myself as protecting our assets in what seemed like an inevitable divorce. I also began documenting her schedule, noting the discrepancies between her claimed activities and her actual whereabouts. The evidence accumulated quickly. Phone calls to Brett that lasted for hours, charged to our home phone bill. Credit card receipts from restaurants I'd never been to, on evenings when she'd claimed to be working late. Most damning of all, I followed her one Thursday evening and watched as she met Brett at an upscale hotel downtown. They emerged from the elevator together 2 hours later, Brett's hand resting possessively on her back as they walked through the lobby. Maggie's hair was slightly disheveled, and she kept glancing around nervously, as if afraid of being recognized. I sat in my truck in the parking garage, watching them say goodbye beside their cars. The kiss they shared was brief, but unmistakably passionate, the embrace of lovers rather than colleagues. That night, I lay awake beside my sleeping wife, studying her face in the dim light from our alarm clock. This woman had been my partner for over 2 decades, had borne my children, had shared my dreams and fears and daily routines. Now she felt like a stranger, someone whose thoughts and motivations I could no longer comprehend. The next morning, I called Bob and asked him to meet me for lunch. "You look terrible," he said as soon as I sat down at our usual restaurant. "I found proof," I replied without preamble. "Emails, hotel receipts, phone records. She's definitely having an affair." Bob leaned back in his chair, his expression grim. "I'm sorry, John. I was hoping you were wrong." "So was I. What's your next move?" "I'm going to confront her tonight. I can't keep living this lie." "Do you want her to end the affair, or do you want to end the marriage?" The question cut to the heart of my dilemma. I don't know. Part of me still loves her, still wants to save what we had. But I don't know if I can ever trust her again. "Trust is like a foundation," Bob said quietly. "Once it's compromised, Everything built on top of it becomes unstable. His metaphor was apt, and we both knew it. As engineers, we'd seen too many structures that looked solid on the surface, but were rotting from within. That evening, I waited for Maggie to come home from work, rehearsing various approaches to the conversation we needed to have. When she finally arrived at nearly 8 o'clock, she seemed surprised to find me sitting at the kitchen table with a glass of scotch. "You're home early," she said, though we both knew I'd been home for hours. "We need to talk." Something in my tone must have warned her, because her expression immediately became guarded. "About what?" "About Brett. About your conference last weekend. About the Thursday evening you spent at the Marriott downtown." The color drained from her face, but she attempted to maintain her composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please don't lie to me anymore, Maggie. I know about the affair." She stood frozen in our kitchen doorway, her purse still clutched in her hands, her face cycling through a series of emotions: surprise, fear, defiance, and finally, resignation. "How long have you known?" she asked quietly. "I've suspected since your birthday party. I've known for certain since last weekend." She moved to the counter and set down her purse, her movements careful and deliberate. "What do you want me to say?" "I want you to tell me the truth. All of it." She poured herself a glass of wine with shaking hands, then sat across from me at the table where we'd shared thousands of meals over the years. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she began. "When Brett joined the firm, I thought we could just be colleagues. But working together every day, spending so much time talking about cases and strategy, old feelings resurfaced." "When did it become physical?" She flinched at my directness. "About 6 weeks ago. We were working late on a brief, and one thing led to another." 6 weeks. I calculated backward, remembering the evening she'd come home unusually late, claiming exhaustion and going straight to bed without her usual recap of her day. "Do you love him?" The question hung between us, loaded with the weight of our entire marriage. Maggie stared into her wine glass for a long moment before answering. "I think I do. But I love you too, John. I know that sounds impossible, but it's true." "No, it's not true. You don't cheat on someone you love. You don't lie to them every day for weeks. You don't plan romantic getaways with another man while pretending to attend professional conferences." Tears began streaming down her face. "I never meant for this to happen. I tried to fight it, but Brett makes me feel alive in ways I haven't felt in years. He's passionate about his work, about life, about everything. When I'm with him, I remember who I used to be before I became just a wife and mother." Her words stung more than I'd expected. "Just a wife and mother? Is that how you see our life together?" "That's not what I meant." "It's exactly what you meant. You're having a midlife crisis, Maggie, and you're destroying our family because of it." "Our family was already broken," she snapped, her sadness transforming into anger. "When's the last time you really looked at me, John? When's the last time we had a conversation about something other than schedules and logistics? You're always working or thinking about work or tinkering with that boat. I've felt invisible in my own home for years. So you decided to have an affair instead of talking to me about it? I tried talking to you. I suggested counseling 2 years ago, and you said we didn't need it. I planned romantic evenings that you cut short because of work calls. I asked you to take vacations, and you always found excuses to postpone them." Her accusations contained enough truth to make them painful. I had been distracted by work, had taken our relationship for granted, had assumed that the foundation of our marriage was solid enough to withstand neglect. "You're right," I admitted. "I haven't been the husband you deserved, but that doesn't justify what you've done." "I know it doesn't, but I can't undo it, and I can't pretend I don't have feelings for Brett." We sat in silence for several minutes, the weight of 23 years pressing down on us. Outside, the October wind rattled our windows, and I found myself thinking about winter storms and the damage they could cause to structures that weren't properly maintained. "What do you want to do?" I asked finally. I don't know. Brett is getting divorced, and he's asked me to consider leaving with him. He's been offered a partnership at a firm in Chicago, and he wants me to come along. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. She wasn't just having an affair, she was planning to leave our marriage entirely. What about our sons? What about the life we've built here? The boys are grown, John. They have their own lives. And what life have we built? We're like roommates who happen to share a mortgage. We could go to counseling now. We could try to rebuild what we've lost. She looked at me with something that might have been pity. Could you really forgive me? Could you ever trust me again? Because I don't think I could live with the constant suspicion and resentment. She was probably right. Even now, sitting across from her, I found myself analyzing every word and expression, looking for signs of deception or manipulation. I need time to think, I said. How much time? I don't know. This isn't exactly a situation I've dealt with before. She nodded, wiping tears from her cheeks. I'll stay at my sister's tonight. Give you some space. As she packed an overnight bag, I sat alone in our kitchen, surrounded by the remnants of our conversation and the ruins of our marriage. The house felt different already, as if her confession had altered the very air we breathed. After she left, I walked through our home, looking at the photographs and mementos that documented our life together. Our wedding picture, taken when we were young and certain that love would conquer everything. Photos of the boys at various ages, family vacations, birthday parties, graduations. The visual history of a relationship that had seemed permanent and unshakable. I ended up in my home office, staring at the blueprints for our latest project. The irony wasn't lost on me. I could design structures that would stand for decades, could calculate load-bearing requirements and stress tolerances with mathematical precision, but I'd failed to maintain the most important structure in my life. That night, I called both of my sons and asked them to come over the following evening. They deserved to hear about the situation from me rather than discovering it through family gossip or their mother's tearful explanations. The foundation had finally collapsed. Now, I needed to figure out what, if anything, could be built from the wreckage. Sydney and James arrived together the next evening, their faces reflecting the concern they'd heard in my voice during our brief phone calls. I'd spent the day rehearsing how to explain their mother's affair and the impending dissolution of their parents' marriage, but no amount of preparation made the conversation easier. "Where's Mom?" James asked as they settled into our living room. "Staying at your Aunt Karen's. We had a difficult conversation last night and she thought it would be better to give me some space." Both boys immediately tensed, their expressions shifting from casual concern to serious attention. "What kind of difficult conversation?" Sydney asked. I'd decided on honesty, tempered with discretion. They were adults, but they were also our children, and they didn't need every painful detail. "Your mother has been having an affair with someone from her office. We're probably going to get divorced." The words landed like stones in still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief. James leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly together, while Sydney sat back as if physically pushed by the news. "Are you sure?" Sydney asked. "I mean, could there be some kind of misunderstanding?" "I'm sure. She admitted it last night." "Who is it?" James's voice was flat, controlled, but I could see anger building behind his eyes. "Her supervisor. Someone she knew in college, before your mother and I met." James stood abruptly and began pacing, his engineer's mind clearly working through the implications. Sydney remained seated, but ran his hands through his hair repeatedly, a nervous habit he'd had since childhood. "How long?" Sydney asked. "About 6 weeks for the physical relationship, probably longer for the emotional connection." "And she's definitely leaving?" "She's considering it. He's been offered a position in Chicago and wants her to go with him." The room fell silent except for James's pacing and the sound of our old house settling around us. Finally, Sydney spoke. "I'm sorry, Dad. This must be incredibly difficult for you." "It is, but I wanted you both to hear it from me, rather than getting bits and pieces from other sources." James stopped pacing and turned to face me. "What are you going to do?" "I honestly don't know yet. Part of me wants to fight for the marriage, to try counseling or separation or whatever it takes to rebuild what we had. But another part of me recognizes that the trust is gone, and without trust, there's no foundation for a relationship." "Do you still love her?" Sydney asked quietly. The question pierced through all my anger and hurt to the core of my confusion. "I love the woman I married 23 years ago. I love the mother of my children, the partner who helped me build this life. But I don't know who she is anymore." James resumed his pacing. "She's selfish. That's who she is. She's throwing away everything we've built as a family for some midlife fantasy." "It's more complicated than that," I said, though I appreciated his loyalty. "Your mother feels like I've been neglecting her, taking our relationship for granted. She's not entirely wrong about that." "That doesn't justify cheating," James replied hotly. "No, it doesn't, but it helps explain how we got here." We talked for another hour, covering practical concerns like living arrangements and holiday plans, as well as emotional issues like their own relationships with Maggie going forward. Both boys were angry with their mother, but also worried about me, and I found their support both comforting and heartbreaking. After they left, I poured myself a scotch and sat on our back patio, looking out at the yard where Maggie had hosted her birthday party just weeks earlier. The decorations were long gone, but I could still picture the scene. Brett's confident smile, Maggie's animated laughter, the undercurrents of attraction that I'd sensed but failed to act upon. My phone rang around 10 o'clock. Maggie's name appeared on the screen, and I debated whether to answer. "Hello? Hi. I wanted to check on you, see how you're doing." "I'm managing. I told the boys tonight." "How did they take it?" "About as well as you'd expect. They're hurt and confused and angry." She was quiet for a moment. "I know this is difficult for everyone. I never wanted to hurt you or them. But you did it anyway." "Yes, I did it anyway. I made choices that I knew would cause pain, and I have to live with that." Her honesty was both refreshing and infuriating. "Have you made a decision about Chicago?" "Not yet. Brett's been patient, but he needs an answer soon. The position starts in January." 3 months away. The timeline felt both impossibly short and endlessly long. "I've been thinking about what you said," she continued, "about counseling, about trying to rebuild. Part of me wants that too, John. But I keep coming back to the same question. Even if we could repair the damage, would we be happy together? I don't know. But shouldn't we try to find out before we throw away 23 years? Maybe. But I also think we need to be honest about why this happened. It wasn't just my midlife crisis or Brett's availability. We've been growing apart for years, becoming different people with different needs and goals. Her analysis stung because it contained truth I didn't want to acknowledge. We had been drifting, settling into comfortable routines that prioritized efficiency over intimacy. "So, what are you saying?" "I'm saying maybe this affair was a symptom of larger problems rather than the cause of them." We ended the call without resolution, both of us needing more time to process the magnitude of what we were facing. Over the following days, I threw myself into work, using the demands of our current projects to avoid thinking about my personal situation. Bob was patient but persistent, checking on me regularly and offering both professional flexibility and personal support. Linda Richardson called twice, extending dinner invitations that I politely declined. The thought of sitting at their table, surrounded by the comfortable domesticity of their successful marriage, felt unbearable. A week after our confrontation, Maggie returned home to collect more clothes and personal items. I arrived from work to find her in our bedroom, carefully packing a large suitcase. "How long are you planning to stay at Karen's?" I asked. "I don't know. until we figure out what comes next, I suppose. She moved through our shared spaces like a ghost, touching familiar objects with a mixture of nostalgia and regret. In her home office, she packed files and legal books, the tools of the career that had brought Brett back into her life. "I've been thinking about what you said," I told her as she prepared to leave. "About counseling, about trying to save the marriage." She stopped packing and looked at me hopefully. "And?" "I'm willing to try, but only if you end the affair completely. No contact with Brett outside of necessary work interactions. No private meetings, no personal calls, no romantic emails." "John, those are my terms, Maggie. I can't compete with an ongoing relationship. If you want to save our marriage, you have to choose our marriage." She sat on the edge of our bed, her hands folded in her lap. "What if I can't? What if I've already chosen?" The question hung between us, heavy with implication. "Then I guess we both know what comes next." She nodded slowly, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I need a few more days to think." "Take all the time you need, but understand that I'm not going to wait indefinitely for you to decide whether our marriage is worth saving." After she left, I walked through our empty house, making mental notes of what would need to be divided if we divorced. The furniture we'd chosen together, the art we'd collected over the years, the accumulated possessions of a shared life. The practical considerations of dissolution seemed overwhelming. That weekend, I drove to the marina and spent 2 days working on my boat. The physical labor of maintenance and repair provided a welcome distraction from emotional turmoil, and the maritime environment offered a sense of peace I couldn't find at home. As I worked, I found myself thinking about longer voyages, about the freedom of open ocean and distant harbors. For years, extended sailing had been a someday dream, postponed by work obligations and family responsibilities. Now, with my marriage crumbling and my sons grown, the dream seemed more achievable. Sunday evening, as I prepared to leave the marina, my phone buzzed with a text from Maggie. "Can we meet tomorrow night? I've made my decision." I stared at the message for several minutes, knowing that her decision would determine the course of the rest of my life. Whatever she'd chosen, I would have to find a way to accept it and move forward. The foundation was gone. Tomorrow, I would learn what, if anything, could be built in its place. Maggie asked to meet at Romano's, the Italian restaurant, where we'd had our first date 24 years earlier. The choice seemed either cruelly ironic or sentimentally appropriate, depending on perspective. I arrived first and chose a quiet table in the back, away from other diners who might overhear what promised to be a difficult conversation. She appeared in the doorway at exactly 7 o'clock, scanning the restaurant until she spotted me. She dressed carefully, a navy blue dress I recognized from happier occasions, her hair styled the way I'd always preferred it. The effort she'd made with her appearance suggested she was hoping to soften whatever blow she was about to deliver. "Thank you for meeting me," she said as she sat across from me. "Of course." We ordered drinks and made awkward small talk while we waited, both of us avoiding the subject that had brought us together. Finally, after the waiter had taken our dinner orders, Maggie folded her hands on the table and looked directly at me. "I've decided to go to Chicago with Brett." The words hit me with surprising force, despite the fact that I'd been preparing myself for this outcome. Hearing it stated so definitively transformed abstract possibility into concrete reality. "When?" "He starts his new position in January. I'll give my notice at the firm after Thanksgiving." 2 months. I calculated quickly. Enough time to file for divorce, to begin the legal process of dissolving our marriage before she left the state. "What about the house, our assets?" "I don't want anything beyond my personal belongings and half of our savings. You can keep the house, the boat, the business. I just want to start fresh." Her generosity surprised me, though I suspected it was motivated more by guilt than fairness. "That's very reasonable. I owe you that much, at least. We ate our dinner in relative silence, the weight of 23 years pressing down on our conversation. Occasionally, one of us would make a comment about the food or the restaurant's renovations, but mostly, we sat with our own thoughts. "I want you to know," Maggie said as we waited for the check, "this isn't about you not being good enough. You're a good man, John. You've been a good husband and father. This is about me needing something different, something I can't find in our life together. I understand. Do you? Because I've been worried that you blame yourself for my choices." I considered her question carefully. "I blame myself for letting our marriage deteriorate to the point where you felt the need to look elsewhere for connection. But I don't blame myself for your decision to have an affair instead of working with me to fix our problems." She nodded, accepting the distinction. "That's fair." After dinner, we sat in the restaurant parking lot in our separate cars, engines running, neither of us quite ready to drive away from this final conversation. Finally, Maggie got out of her car and approached my window. "I'm sorry, John. For all of it. You deserved better." "So did you," I replied, and meant it. She leaned down and kissed my forehead through the open window, a gesture that felt like both an apology and a goodbye. Then she returned to her car and drove away, leaving me alone under the restaurant's neon sign. The next morning, I called a divorce attorney recommended by Bob. Margaret Brown was a no-nonsense woman in her 50s who specialized in dissolution cases involving significant assets. She listened to my situation without judgment, taking notes and asking practical questions about property division and custody arrangements. "Since your children are adults, we won't need to address custody issues," she explained. "And if your wife is truly willing to accept a minimal settlement, this should be relatively straightforward. The main complication will be timing. If she's planning to leave the state in 2 months, we'll need to move quickly to finalize everything." I authorized her to begin the paperwork immediately. That afternoon, I called both Sydney and James to inform them of their mother's decision. Sydney took the news with resigned sadness. "I hoped she'd choose differently, but I can't say I'm completely surprised." James was more direct in his anger. "She's making a huge mistake. This Brett guy is going to disappoint her, and she'll realize what she gave up." "Maybe, but that's her choice to make." "Are you okay, Dad?" The question caught me off guard. I'd been so focused on practical arrangements that I hadn't fully processed my emotional response to Maggie's decision. "I'm sad," I admitted, "and angry, but also relieved in a way. At least now I know where I stand." Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the logistics of divorce. There were papers to sign, assets to evaluate, and practical arrangements to make. Maggie and I met twice with our respective attorneys to work out the details, maintaining a polite but distant relationship that felt surreal after decades of intimacy. She moved out of Karen's house and into an apartment downtown, closer to her office and to Brett. I didn't ask for details about their living arrangements, and she didn't volunteer information. We were already becoming strangers to each other, our shared history beginning to feel like something that had happened to different people. At work, Bob provided steady support without being intrusive. He took on additional responsibilities to give me flexibility for legal meetings, and he made sure I ate lunch when I forgot to take breaks. Linda sent home-cooked meals twice a week, understanding instinctively that I wasn't taking proper care of myself. "You're handling this better than I expected," Bob observed one afternoon as we reviewed project timelines. "Am I? I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water." "That's normal. Divorce is like demolition. It's messy and disorienting, but it's necessary before you can build something new." His construction metaphor was apt, though I wasn't ready to think about building anything new. I was still processing the destruction of what I'd thought was permanent. 3 weeks before Thanksgiving, Maggie called to discuss holiday arrangements. "I know this is awkward," she said, "but I was hoping we could figure out some way to spend Thanksgiving with the boys together. As a family, one last time." The request seemed both reasonable and impossible. "I don't think that's a good idea, Maggie. It would be confusing for everyone." "You're probably right. But I hate the thought of the boys having to choose between us. They're adults. They can make their own decisions about how to spend the holidays." In the end, Sydney and James decided to have Thanksgiving dinner with me at our house, their childhood home, while planning to visit their mother the following weekend. The arrangement felt artificial but workable. I spent Thanksgiving morning preparing our traditional meal, following recipes that Maggie had perfected over the years. The irony of cooking her dishes in her absence wasn't lost on me, but the familiar routines provided comfort in their predictability. The boys arrived at noon, both bringing side dishes and forced cheerfulness. We ate dinner at our dining room table, the same table where we'd shared hundreds of family meals, but Maggie's empty chair dominated the conversation despite our efforts to ignore it. "This is weird," James finally said, voicing what we were all thinking. "Yeah, it is," I agreed. "But we'll figure out new traditions." "Will you stay in the house?" Sydney asked. "For now. It's too big for one person, but I'm not ready to make any major changes yet." After dinner, we watched football and played cards, trying to recreate the comfortable domesticity of previous holidays. But the effort required to maintain normalcy was exhausting, and we were all relieved when the evening ended. That night, alone in our house, I walked through rooms filled with memories and tried to imagine what my life would look like once the divorce was finalized. The silence was profound, broken only by the familiar sounds of our old house settling and the distant hum of traffic. For the first time since Maggie's confession, I allowed myself to fully feel the magnitude of what I was losing. Not just a wife, but a way of life, a shared identity, a future I'd taken for granted. The grief was overwhelming, but also cleansing, like a storm that clears the air. December arrived with unseasonably cold weather and the final divorce papers. Maggie and I met one last time at our attorney's office to sign the documents that would legally end our marriage. She looked tired and nervous, her usual confidence replaced by something that might have been regret. "Any second thoughts?" I asked as we waited for the notary. "Every day," she replied, "but I think we both know this is the right decision." I wasn't sure I agreed, but I signed the papers anyway. 2 weeks later, Maggie left for Chicago with Brett, driving away from our house and our life together with a U-Haul trailer attached to her car. I watched from our bedroom window as she loaded the last of her belongings, feeling like I was witnessing the end of an era. The house felt enormous and empty after she left. I wandered through rooms that still smelled like her perfume, past closets that held only my clothes, through a kitchen designed for family meals that I now ate alone. But along with the sadness came an unexpected sense of possibility. For the first time in decades, my life was entirely my own to shape. The foundation of my marriage was gone, but I was still standing, still capable of building something new. I just had to figure out what that something would be.